Thank you for participating in the Humane Summit, a virtual speaker series brought to you by the Humane Education Coalition. This session is sponsored by the Griffin Press and the Humane Society of the United States. We are grateful for your attendance today for Pierce Delahunt's speaker session, Social Emotional Learning for Social Justice. Pierce holds a Master of Education from the Institute for Humane Education. Their research was a study of activist education programs throughout the country. Pierce has worked with Youth Empowered Action and Activist Education Summer Camp since 2014. They currently live in an eco-van traveling the country and speaking at schools. At this time, I will pass things over to our speaker, Pierce Delahunt.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Pierce Delahunt. I am an activist educator. I travel the country visiting mostly schools as a guest speaker talking about social justice. My background before activist education in general was social emotional learning, and I look at a lot of the work that I do now as at the union of those two things. That's my email signature. Those two quotations up there are some of my favorites. Bullying is not a rite of passage. Empathy is a rite of passage. It opens us up. It brings us more into union with the world. You do not have to work for justice. You can live your whole life being oppressive or being a passerby or a bystander, but you get to, and it's an opportunity, and you can choose to do it. You can see some of my outlets out there. The original content you can find at Instagram and Medium primarily. YouTube, Pinterest, and Goodreads are more collected resources that are categorized by oppression or social justice issue. There's some original content on the YouTube. But so that's a little bit of my background. I went to the Institute for Humane Education. I have a Master of Education from them. And now I teach with Youth Empowered Action. It's a summer camp that teaches activism and social justice. All right, so let's get started. This is Social Emotional Learning for Social Justice. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to take the lessons from what I call mainstream individualist social emotional learning, and we're going to apply a group or systems analysis to it. And from that, we'll see how we get social justice and what we can do about it. So social emotional learning, relationships, feelings, and educational content material. Most mainstream individualist social emotional learning deals with a one-on-one relationship. And those can be complicated, for sure. But typically, they are going to be simpler than when we're looking at a group situation, such that when we see an angry person dealing with a sad person, we can look at that and we can generally say that is an abusive relationship. Of course, there are all kinds of complications to that. I'm very aware. But in general, when we see someone screaming at a sad person, we can point it out and we can say there's a problem here, let's do something about it. But when we take that aside and we develop a community, then it becomes much more complicated. And under what I would call the mainstream social emotional, individualist social emotional learning, if we take that community and they have fulfilling lives and they have fulfilling relationships and they never get into a fight, they never have a misunderstanding, in this completely fictional, completely impossible world, mainstream individualist social emotional learning says, you did it, you won. You have accomplished everything that mainstream individualist social emotional learning can offer you, and now you win the prize of living that life. I say that is not enough. If community A is living this life where not any of them ever get into a fight, they're all thrilled, happy people, and they all have wonderful, fulfilling lives and relationships, but it is at the expense of community B, whom they never even meet, by virtue of all the principles of individualist mainstream social emotional learning, which I understand most of you educators are already somewhat familiar with. By those principles, we can call that bad social emotional learning. And the fact that those happy people are living at the expense of this other community, community B, means that we need to address it. We need to intervene somehow, just the same way we would intervene in an individual one-on-one relationship. But of course, then the question becomes, well, if these people never see, if community A never meets or comes into contact with community B, then how is this happening? And the answer is usually that there's an enforcer community. So that's the broad outlook of how a lot of different systems of supremacy and oppression work. We can look at this in a lot of different ways. If we're talking about big R racism, white supremacy, community A would be white folk, community B would be folk of color, and community C, depending on the context, I would say could be the police, could be a variety of situations. If we're talking about international US imperialism, community A would be folk from the United States or other colonizing countries. Community B would be those countries that are being colonized. Community C would be the military. And if we're talking about class, we could say community A is going to be the wealthy folk. Community B is going to be the lower middle class folk, and community C, I would say, is the government. We can look at it a lot of different ways. With big S sexism, we can talk about community A being males, community B being females, as well as gender nonconforming and queer folk. And we can say C is, in that context, the perpetrators primarily of sexual assault. And obviously, right, I have these in 3 separate circles, but we can look at it as more of a Venn diagram where there can be overlap in these various communities, right? Race is complicated. Some people are mixed race, those kinds of things too. And then I've drawn humans, right? But we can also talk about animal oppression. We can talk about community A being humans, community B being non-human animals, especially for food, and community C being slaughterhouse workers, for example, or fast food chain executives, or whatever the case may be. We can also address the environmental destruction. So community A, again, is humans. Community B is the entire planet and environment and ecosystems and the Earth's ability to support life. Community C, and there's a lot there, but we can call it capitalism. So those different communities those different supremacies and systems of oppression all work in general in this simplified way with these communities in order to bring about the patterns that I think we can highlight. So how does this happen? Well, in individualist mainstream social emotional learning, we talk about the 4 Ds of disconnection. A lot of what I'm sharing, by the way, does come from nonviolent communication, which is one of my primary sources with social emotional learning. I do use others, but I'm a big fan of NVC. NVC talks about the 4 Ds of disconnection. They don't harp on it too much, but they talk about it. So 4 Ds of disconnection, let's go through it. We have deserve, deny, diagnose, and demand. Deserve is a big one. We'll save that for the last. But deny, when we talk about disconnection, by the way, there's a tendency, and I have had this tendency before in the 4 Ds of disconnection, to think of it as disconnecting from others. And that is definitely true. But the disconnection is also disconnecting from ourselves, our sense of responsibility, from the reality of the world around us. So it's a very large concept of disconnection that we're talking about. So when we say denial and the deny tactic of disconnecting, we're talking about a denial of responsibility, a denial of reality, a denial of the other person's experience. Any one of those things is something that allows us to disconnect and is a disconnection in itself. So in a one-on-one relationship, that could be, no, I didn't do that, or no, my actions don't have those consequences, or no, you're not really feeling that way. You don't feel that bad. Those kinds of things. Diagnose would be someone presenting an issue that they're experiencing, and we say, yeah, you know what your problem is? Like, I've figured it out. Or like, you had this kind of issue when you were young, and like now you're going through this. And there are ways, by the way, that can be helpful sometimes in identifying patterns and learning. But it is often a way to disconnect rather than actually be present with the person and see them. Demand. In this context, NVC clarifies that a demand is different from a request, in that a demand is something that if the person does not adhere to or does not accept, then you attempt to punish them afterwards. So demand is something where it's not actually allowing the other person to choose, it's forcing them. And when we use force in that way, a punitive force, rather than the protective use of force, which nonviolent communication will clarify, that is a method of disconnection. Now back to deserve. Deserve is a big one because deserve is about the moralistic judgment of punishment and reward, and that applies to ourselves and to others. So when we think that we deserve good things or bad things, and when we think that others deserve good things or bad things based on these moralistic judgments, that is a way to disconnect, because now I don't care whether someone is going through hardship. Now I care with whether they deserve their hardship or not. And that allows us to disconnect. So those are the ways that that shows up on an individual level. And the better that we can understand how that shows up on an individual level, even in the context of an abusive relationship, then the better we can understand how those show up in this group setting. So going back to these 4Ds, let's think of them now in the realm of social justice, or in a group systems analysis. So 4Ds of disconnection: deserve. These people are criminals. They deserve what they get, right? We are the story of American exceptionalism. Like, we deserve all these good things. We can take these things from people because of how we have risen to the top of the economic ladder, or the food chain, or whatever the case may be. Deny. We're not responsible for what is happening in these other countries, right? We're not responsible for what was happening in Honduras, even though we supported a coup. We're not responsible for what was happening in Yemen, even though it's a US-backed war. We're not responsible, or those things aren't happening, right? Racism doesn't exist. Like, why can't we all just be colorblind and not see color? Denial of reality. Diagnose. Yeah, like, these people, the things that they're going through, it's because of this. Or like, women just have this like sense that like they're so sensitive to things, and so like when they talk about their experiences, you have to understand that like they are being too sensitive, and they don't understand things the way we men do. Those kinds of stories. Demand. We want your resources. We want your vote. We want to put a military base in your country. We will take whatever our demands are. Wealthy folk, we demand to keep our money, even though it has come through the surplus labor of the workers who supported us. So that is, again, the 4Ds of disconnection as applied to a systems analysis in this group setting. So what does this mean? What do we do, given that this is the situation? This is something called ring theory. You can see comfort in, dump out. Some people use care in and crap out. But you can see at the center is the aggrieved or the afflicted, right? And then there are other people on the outside. So this is, again, an individualist framework. But so someone going through a hardship, right? The aggrieved or the afflicted. The idea is to bring the comfort to them and all of their trauma, like help them get that out. So it is okay for a person on the end there called a looky-loo. It is okay for a looky-loo to vent about some hardship that the person in the middle is going through. But you don't want that looky-loo to be venting about it to the person going through the hardship. That just adds more trauma to the person already going through trauma. The looky-loo can vent about it to someone outside of that group or in their circle, right? In a social justice setting, I would actually say that this is basically an individualist representation of the concept of self-sovereignty, or self-determination, or sovereignty, or nothing about us without us, right? The idea that people are free to express themselves and to choose how they live their lives, right? Rather than people in power telling them how to do that. When we're in trauma, when we are aggrieved or afflicted, we, in that social emotional context, have less power than the people who are not in trauma. And so it's the responsibility then to do something about that. By the way, obviously, everything I'm talking about, I'm addressing those big systems of oppression. These concepts can, in theory, certainly apply to little r racial prejudice and those kinds of things. But as a wealthy white male, I'm not going to preach about whatever issues the communities of color need to figure out for themselves, right? My job is to address these greater supremacist oppressions, especially as a person in several positions of power, so that I can help dismantle these systems. And so that's why I'm speaking in solidarity, or an attempt to be in solidarity. That helps me meet my need for contributing to the world. Solidarity, I found, is a better strategy. So what do we do? The 4Ds of intervention then. Again, these are individualist ideas, but delegate, delay, distract, and direct. and then in parentheses, compassion. So in an individualist setting, I often speak at schools. I use the example of school bullies. So delegate. If we don't feel comfortable for whatever reason stepping in, we can get maybe a person of an authority, a teacher, or maybe just a friend who feels more comfortable stepping in than we do for whatever reason. Delay. Maybe we don't feel comfortable stepping in right at that moment when a person is being bullied, but we can, after the fact, check in with the person who was bullied and say, hey, I saw that and I didn't feel comfortable stepping in, but I want to let you know that I saw it, and do you need anything? We can also do that to the bully. Sometimes stepping in right when the bullying has happened isn't a totally safe option, but after the fact, the bully might be more open to hearing what it is we have to say and say, hey, like, I saw that and I want you to know that's not cool. I didn't feel comfortable stepping in right then, but I wanted to say something. Distract. In that context, it's a little more creative. We can say to the bully, hey, excuse me, I'm trying to figure out something out here in the context of street harassment. You can ask for directions, or make a loud noise or whatever, and just stop the abuse from happening by virtue of distracting the abuser. And then direct. We can just walk in and say, hey, this needs to stop right now. This is not cool. And in parentheses, I put compassion because I like to emphasize that hurt people are the ones who hurt people. And so in an individualist setting, we can say, like, hey, like, is everything all right with you? Like, I see that something here is wrong. And often they'll say, no, like, I'm good. Like, I don't care. And we'll say, no, I've seen good people before. This isn't what good, happy people do. So, like, tell me, what's up? And we can also do that with the person being bullied right then. We can say, hey, like, are you okay? Like, do you want to step out? Like, can we talk? And that kind of thing. But as far as it goes with the systemic analysis, right? How does this apply? Delegate. There's a couple different ways that we can delegate in a group way. We can always talk about how money applies to every one of these. So in a monetary setting, delegate is donating. When we donate to a cause, we're saying, here, I'm going to support your ability to do something about this issue because I don't have the time, or I can't do it as well as you can. You're better set up, whatever the case may be. Or trusting other people to do other things. We pass that information about an abuse to someone who's better suited to do those kinds of things. Delayed. My personal favorite example of a delayed intervention in this context is reparations, right? The injustice of slavery already happened. There's nothing we can do about making it not happen, but there is something we can do about compensation for injustice. And so reparations is, I think, a really prime example of that one. Distract, in terms of this context, distract is going to be more on the creative and political side. So if there is a bill that is happening, or if an oppressor group is trying to force something through some other channel, oftentimes distract will apply more where there is a deadline in this context. So that way we can distract the resources. I actually think the right is very good at distracting the left in a lot of situations as far as a lot of these oppressions go. And that is something that we can better examine. But often there's a lot of infighting on the left about what counts as a distraction and what counts as an actual problem. So I do want to give voice to that. Direct action is a solid way to intervene in an injustice. And there are a whole bunch of different scenarios that can look like. That can look like blockading in various forms. That can look like occupations, right? Occupy Wall Street, etc. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. And obviously, any one of these in any specific context will carry specific risks. And it is on us to figure out what risks we are comfortable with, what risks we are safe with, whether or not we are comfortable with those, and what amount of risk we need to push ourselves into or lean into. I, as a wealthy white male, I am safer in a lot more contexts than a poor person of color in this country. And I can take more risk, especially with direct action. And so it is important to take those into consideration and put those into context. So those are the ideas of the 4 Ds of intervention as applied to social justice, group setting, systemic analysis. But there may be overwhelming amount going on, and we can't figure out what it is we want to do. And we don't know how to delegate, delay, distract, or direct in any one of these scenarios. So what is it we can do when we're feeling stuck? I like to leave everyone with the 3 always things. The 3 always things are stuff that you can do anytime, at any level, even if you're stuck in whatever capacity. So there's research, support, and engage. So the research, you can always learn more about whatever's going on. You can always learn more about an issue you care about. You can always learn more about an issue you don't know a lot about. You can always learn more about how those issues intersect. I find that understanding the intersections and the intersectionality of issues is a really helpful way to understanding lived experiences. Support. Maybe you don't feel comfortable engaging in direct activism, but you know someone who does, and you can help them take care of themselves. You can make them meals. You can, whatever services you can, just making them tea and checking on them and calling them, seeing how they're doing, providing emotional support counts as activism. You can support yourself. Self-care is activism, especially in this world built on destroying ourselves. Engage. You can always engage with other people who disagree with you. There are ways to do that healthfully, and we can talk about that in other contexts, but you can always learn from them about what it is the other side believes and how to respond to that. I think the important thing there is to focus on building the relationship and focus on building your own skills in terms of responding to those arguments rather than actually trying to convince someone. That is going to be bad for our mental health. Those are what I call the three always things: research, support, and engage. And again, my name is Pierce Delahunt. You've just experienced social emotional learning for social justice. You can reach out to me on any one of these. My handle on all social media is delapierced. You can reach me at delapierced@gmail.com. For any more information, I'm more than happy and grateful to talk about these issues. Thank you.
This concludes our speaker session. Thank you so much for joining us. You can learn more here or by clicking the resource links in the summit. We hope you've enjoyed this speaker session and that you'll join us for another one soon. Please consider making a donation to the Humane Education Coalition to help us continue providing programs and events like the Humane Summit. We rely on your support to help create a more compassionate, just, and sustainable future through education. Visit hecoalition.org/give to contribute today. Thanks again.